Good afternoon, and welcome back to Quantitative Reasoning Online. Lesson 15E, Conclusions. So let's take a look at what in conclusion is. In this one, we're going to understand the characteristics of observational and experimental statistical studies, understand the types of conclusions that can be made in the observational and experimental studies, understand why observational studies need representative samples but not experiments, and understand that blocking can help make the experiments more sensitive to changes caused by treatments. So in this class, we're going to learn more about making appropriate conclusions, to prepare and review the elements that would be considered when designing studies. Tutorial for preview, lesson 15, part E begins here. The two questions to be on your mind as we go through this. What design elements are important in an observational study in order to make an appropriate conclusion? And question 2, what design elements are important in an experimental study in order to make an appropriate conclusion? So keep these questions on your mind. Select the correct answer. Which statement is true? Observational studies can make conclusions about cause and effect, while experimental studies can make conclusions about association between variables. Observational studies can make conclusions about association between variables, while experimental studies can make conclusions about cause and effect. A and B are true, A and B neither is true. Okay, well, let's see. What do we know about experimental studies? Well, we have a explanatory, variable, a response variable, response variable, and the whole idea of doing experiments to see if there is a cause and effect between explanatory and response. As I change X, how does Y behave? That's an experiment. So, process of elimination, SBC then. So it says correct. I'm going to say experimental studies focus on treatments given to a sample, but it would be ideal if you could apply the results to the entire larger population. Suppose a treatment is shown to be effective using randomly selected experimental subjects from Texas. What statement is correct? The treatment is effective for all population members within or outside of Texas. The treatment is effective for the population in Texas but nowhere else. The treatment is effective for the population in Texas, and further research could prove whether effectiveness applies outside of Texas as well. Read them again. The treatment is effective for all population members within or outside of Texas. The treatment is effective for population in Texas but nowhere else. The treatment is effective for population in Texas, and further research could prove whether effectiveness applies outside of Texas as well. And we may be tempted to say this, but because the people in Texas aren't that much different than people in Idaho versus the people in New York versus the Floridians versus California. That may be a little different versus Arizona. But in a good experimental study, you may want to consider, maybe Texas has some uniqueness in its population. So this is probably true. However, The last one is probably the best. It's a treatment effect for population in Texas. However, further research could prove whether it applies outside of Texas as well, instead of just assuming it is. And that's correct. What are the other responses here? And if we really wanted this experiment study to focus on not just Texas, we should have had a representative sampling of test subjects that would have immediately proven it was also outside of Texas. When researchers conduct an experiment, what? They sometimes separate people in blocks. They might create blocks by ethnicity, gender, or age. Why would they do that? Because they think these groups might react differently to the treatment that researchers will give. Different factors create too much variability in treatment groups, so it's better to separate them. Because researchers want to discover for whom the treatment works best, which is true. Researchers will not separate groups in this way. The results are strongest when there is much variety of individuals in the control and treatment group. We want to minimize variability. I do recall this was basically a statement from one of the earlier tutorials. By limiting the factors within a group, you minimize variability just because maybe differences in how they react. So we block them to minimize that. So yes. Visit the pages given from the National Institute of Health as given. Okay, so let's look at these real quick. These are different gastric surgeries. One's a bypass, one's a sleeve. And so let's read this guide real quick. What question is being asked? Supposedly this title gives us the bypass gastric surgery, that this surgery makes sure something smaller. Make what smaller? Make your stomach smaller? The surgery will make your stomach smaller to make you feel full with less food. The food you eat will no longer go in some parts of your stomach, and small intestine absorbs food. Because of this, your body will not get all the calories from the food you eat. Wow. Does it make your stomach smaller? There's the next one. It's different. Yep, it's a different article. Now the sleeve gastrectomy will make your stomach about the size of a. Oh, that's interesting. Vertical sleeve gastrectomy is surgery to help with weight loss. The surgery removes a large portion of your stomach. Eee. The new smaller stomach is about the size of a banana. Limits the amount of food you can eat by making you feel full after eating small amounts of food. That is very extreme. Size of a banana. Supporting, so I want to talk about? Okay. How to read an article makes the stomach smaller, makes the stomach about the size of a banana. So how confident are you that you understand the characteristics of observation? God, there's so many multi-syllable words here. Observational and experimental statistical studies. Somewhat. How confident are you that you understand the types of conclusions that can be made? Somewhat. How confident are you that you understand that why observational studies need representative samples from the experiments? Somewhat. And confident understand that blocking can help make experiments more sensitive to changes. Somewhat. I'll be honest, I'm trying to figure out what those articles were about in this section, but hey. With that, we've done the conclusions for Lesson 15, Part E of Lesson 15. Go back, read them again, do some more investigation on your own, and we'll be back shortly and do the 6 questions for this section.